Dear Mr. Paulson, dear colleagues, MPs, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Mr. Paulson, for the invitation to come here this morning. Thank you very much that we have got the Berlin Forum Foreign Policy together with the Körber Foundation and the Foreign Ministry. We can do this already the sixth time, and thank you also to the audience that this morning you come here to converge on rather indigestible subjects. And thank you very much to my Italian colleague, dear Paolo. Thank you for coming. You have to know that Paolo Gentioni would also come just for the Körber-Stiftung Foundation for this event, but the reason is manifold, and not just the bilateral discussion we had yesterday evening. But yesterday that was a typical afternoon in which we didn't necessarily talk about current crises, but rather about the long shadows of the events of more than 70 years ago, even today. That there's shadows on German-Italian relations. We went to Schöneweide together, and when you remember the past years, then with regard to processing German-Italian history, there was the massacre of the German Wehrmacht that the focus was on, and yesterday we addressed an issue that is, well, not quite as well studied as the subject. So this is the subject of military internees of Italy. So after the capitulation of the Italians in 43, last 1.5 years of the war, 560,000 Italian soldiers were captured and interned in camps, and there they had the bitter choice either to serve in Hitler's army or to go in a forced labor in the armament industry. So 53,000 people died there. For instance, in Berlin and Schöneweide, there was such a camp, and that's where we inaugurated a memorial together. It's a small but a very well done exhibition. So between these chairs, so because first of all, it's not well known, and I would like you, so if you've got the possibility, to have a look at that exhibition. So back to the subject. So before my departure in a few minutes to Ukraine, it couldn't have been more fitting. So the crisis as the normal status quo, and indeed as the new normal. So the crisis mode is the current situation and condition of the world. That's what it seems to be. But I have to say that we have to understand. So even if we say that crisis is the new normal, this it doesn't explain much, does it? So when we take a closer look at the crisis situation of this world, then we see that it's multiple, but also very diverse types of crises. We have to talk about, and we have actually put them under one headline. Often it's disruptions, decisions that trigger insecurity, like Brexit, as well as violence in Ukraine, the war in Syria, the unresolved conflict in Syria and Libya, and Mr. Paulson mentioned Turkey, and of course also the election of Donald Trump as the new U.S. president will bring about change, of which at the moment we don't know what direction it's going to take, what the magnitude is of that election. And because that's the case, it will trigger insecurity also in Europe today, or is regarded as insecurity. Taken all together, and this is what the subject of this debate is going to be in a minute, if you take it together, then that is a very sobering picture that we have looking at the world. So what we have to tell time and again is that we shouldn't be paralyzed by this condition and not describe the condition of the world and then drop into inactivity or faint. So we need activity, and that's why I'm happy about this forum, and that's being held in these conditions. Now it's more and more about a responsible foreign policy, and I have to say, and I want to stress, especially with regard to Brexit and the European crisis. Also, this is about a responsibly minded foreign policy in Europe. So, and those who know me, when I talk about foreign policy and committed foreign policy, I don't mean blind activism. I do not mean that foreign policy and successful foreign policy is marked by just hectic activities, but rather that we have to be consistent and based, hopefully, on clever analysis and will not be discouraged in the first or second step the success will not come. So I'm saying this also with regard to my trip that I'm going to go to Minsk soon. So how many have said and written over the past days, what's Minsk got to do with it, the Minsk agreement, what did it bring, what's the outcome of Minsk, and the insecurity in eastern Ukraine is still there and the conflict is not resolved, and it's true. However, in diplomacy and foreign policy, sometimes you have to look at hypothetical causes. What would have happened if certain decisions had not been taken? What would have happened in Ukraine if we had not found the way to the Minsk agreement? I think everyone knows that, and everyone will remember that then, that's now more than 2 years ago, we faced a situation in which the conflict in the Donbass region threatened to enlarge, and the conquest of Mariupol by the separatists was imminent. And many said and wrote and reported about the land bridge being built from the Donbass region to Transnistria and Moldova. So I believe that time and again we have to assess the situation properly and say the Minsk agreement was not the solution to the conflict. However, that the Minsk agreement at least was a containment of this conflict, and the conflict didn't spread throughout the whole eastern Ukraine, and thus prevented also that there's a major large-scale confrontation between East and West in the middle of Europe, reaching far beyond Ukraine. And of course, and I have to stress that the Minsk agreement is not the solution. And of course, the implementation steps that we have been taking since the Minsk agreement, since the signing of the Minsk agreement, is very slow. And of course, the situation is that whenever we've got armistice, that we've agreed that that few days or few weeks after they were broken again, and but at least the stage of escalation has been reduced considerably, and the meetings at foreign minister level, at the bosses level in Berlin just recently, we were able to keep the situation under control. And we're building the next steps to actually make the armistice even more stable. And for instance, by the ceasefire, and where's the violation of the ceasefire, and there we try to actually keep apart and draw apart the troops of both sides, or the withdrawal of the heavy weapons from the confrontation line. So all of this is very difficult, but I believe that according to my experience, we won't have any other possibility than to face these difficulties. And we shouldn't be disappointed and depressed, but rather be consistent in our work in implementing the individual obligations from the Minsk agreement, as long as the conflict parties themselves regard the Minsk agreement as the basis of solving their conflict. So what is much more difficult are the subjects in Syria and Libya, which we're going to talk about in a minute, I suppose. Syria is a snapshot, and it's very difficult to describe the situation. So to say it up front, I believe that so much as we're looking at eastern Aleppo and how catastrophic the situation actually is, and how unbearable the pictures and the ideas are, that the humanitarian catastrophe will actually stretch out for more weeks and months. There is the hope of the regime, or the expectation of the regime and those who support them, Russia and Iran, the hope that with eastern Aleppo anything is going to be decided in Syria. That is something I do not share. I don't share that notion. So there's so many neighbors and regional players that have invested in this conflict. This conflict is not going to end regardless of what is happening in eastern Aleppo at the moment militarily. So the current situation, so we need to state that, and that is where everything point. Also the switch, everyone is waiting for the new president in the United States, the regime in Damascus, and the supporters in Russia and Iran have used their chance to actually avail of this interim status to change the military situation on the ground in Syria with regard to eastern Aleppo. So we are undertaking efforts, and I hope that we're going to have a discussion in Minsk with the Russian side also to get a minimum degree of humanitarian support over the next days on the ground. So Libya. Yesterday evening, we had the possibility to have a longer exchange about Libya and the conflict there. So this is a conflict that is currently not escalating. So the legitimate government in Tripoli is actually quite successful in fighting back the ISIS forces and Sirte. But we have to know that the military situation is actually switching to General Haftar's benefit, and the compromise, the political compromise that we need in Libya to prevent the breaking apart of the country. So this political compromise is becoming more and more urgent. And yesterday we talked about that, what initiatives we're going to use, and we're looking at the neighboring states, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Chad and Turkey, those who are present in Libya. And this bridge is necessary to build between Tobruk and Tripoli. So this is what we want to achieve. So when we look at all these conflict and regions of conflict, all of that is close to our European borders, and that's why there's insecurity. And after Brexit, so what people expect from us, and Mr. Paulsen, this is what I also saw in your survey. So people expect from Europe that we deliver. That, especially in those areas, and Paolo Gentioni is going to say something about that in a minute, in those areas we have to deliver answers where we didn't give any answers before, like in migration. But if I see it correctly, then the Germans too, looking at Europe, we've got one expectation, that European foreign policy will be stronger and more visible, and that in the European policy, that the member states will be better cooperating, stronger in cooperation in Europe. And this is what I actually put into a paper together after the Brexit decision, together with France, first of all, and then we discussed it together with our Italian friends. We extended that paper, and that's the position we put forward. So the Germans and the people in the European member states need to be shown what we do in guaranteeing security and what we are prepared to do. And I believe, looking at the last joint committee of the foreign and defense ministers in Europe, it became clear that there's great readiness amongst the European member states, minus Great Britain, to go about the common European defense and security policy. But I have to say, in coordination with the existing international organizations, so in other words, with the United Nations and with the Organization of Cooperation and Security in Europe. And what is even more urgent, and where the questions are even louder within the European Union, of course, not as a competitor to NATO, but as a supplement to NATO, and also in a complementary relationship. So this is what we are currently doing in Europe. Well, this is what we're discussing in Europe together. And dear Paolo, that is something that, and at the anniversary of the Rome Treaty, we will be able to deliver next year. So clear defense and security structures also in the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, so those were some few comments and ideas within few minutes that I have available in order to discuss the current crises. Just a few demands that we have for ourselves with regard to Europe, but at the same time, we do have to become clear why, so according to my opinion anyway, we are in such a difficult, devilish situation with regard to solutions, to finding solutions to these conflicts, so that are waiting for solution and difficult to achieve. So those who've got the quick answers, yes, with regard to Middle East, yeah, there was the High-Speed agreement, or with regard to the conflict in Syria, It's the mistakes that have been made in the military intervention in Iraq. Some say it's with regard to North Africa. The intervention in Libya was the decisive point of destabilization. So there's some truth in everything that is said, but that's not the explanation for the difficulties that we are facing at the moment. But rather, with regard to what makes the solution so difficult at the moment are the differences in the nature of these conflicts. With regard to the structure of the order that we have players. So I'll just give you a brief overview. So if, for instance, if we, so the Italians and the German, were to mediate in a conflict, we do this mediation of a conflict based, so on the basis of an international order with values as they're embodied in the United Nations, the Charter of the United Nations, and the Human Rights Convention. So at the same time, we compete with a Russia that is more and more visibly using a different order, and this model of order is not so much based on the rules that we talk about, but rather it goes towards Yalta more. We're looking at the distribution of the world or split of the world into zones of influence. And when we look at the new conflicts in the Middle East, this is the signature of the 21st century, that we're not don't have the large-scale confrontation between the individual states anymore, but rather that we've got more and more regional conflicts that we're going to see, and this is power policy, and this is about power and influence, but at the same time, over the course of the conflict, this is overlaid by religious or ethnic aspects. So this is what we're seeing with the Syrian conflict at the moment, and this is making the solution so difficult. Everything else in the discussion, thank you very much.